Newcastle United have beaten Arsenal by 1-0, and in this video we're going to be diving into how they did it, including the tactical setup that they used to not only nullify Arsenal, but ultimately get themselves the win. The fallout from this game will mostly be around Arsenal and what they didn't manage to do, when instead it really should be focused on Newcastle and what they managed to do to stop Arsenal in their tracks. But to better understand that, we need to work out what Arsenal were trying to do. They set up originally in their 4-4-2. Or that's exactly how it looked like on paper. In a matter of fact, what actually happened was that Havertz dropped a little bit deeper on occasion, Trossard stayed forwards, and you had Rice and Merino rotating in positions to better utilise the football. Merino moving over into this left-hand channel, Martinelli moving wide, Havertz dropping, and Trossard moving forwards, Rice moving centrally. This created almost their midfield three, Havertz in that Odegaard position, Trossard up front, Martinelli and Merino moving down this left-hand channel. Now this is really interesting because it posed Newcastle a number of different problems, and the way they worked with that and the way they tried to combat that was also just as interesting. Joe Willock and Sean Longstaff brought legs into the midfield, and Joe Linton brought a serious solidity down that Newcastle left-hand side. But it was what they did in the centre of the park that really started to dictate the way that Newcastle would start to defend this match. Joe Willock would jump. And he would jump to do this. It created Newcastle and allowed them to defend in the first half in a 4-4-2. And it meant that they were already able to outnumber Declan Rice in the centre of the park when he needed to receive the ball. This also allowed them to jump onto the centre-backs or even to the right-back or left-back to really pressurise Arsenal into giving up momentums and possessions and allow them to really create and force turnovers. Although Arsenal didn't really break under this pressure, it set the tone for the game, and it was the work rate that came with this that I thought was so very impressive from Newcastle. With this, they were also able to dictate the tempo of the match. Arsenal started off quite well, but soon, once you had Longstaff pressurising, once you had Bruno pressurising, Joe Linton doing the same, it allowed for Newcastle to start to gain the edge in the match, and then you're looking towards the way that they went forwards. Let's just take the idea of Joe Willock breaking free from that Newcastle midfield to try and cause Arsenal some problems, not only out of possession, but also in possession. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. So you've got the two Newcastle midfielders in Sean Longstaff and Bruno Guimaraes. You've got Lewis Hall here, and you've got Tino Livramento. Joe Linton is really far high, and is ready to make that run in beyond past Thomas Partey, but you've got Joe Willock right here in the centre of the park, almost being that link between defence and attack. Not only is he able to then go and pressurise the defence when he needs to without the ball, he's also then able to help link play and play passes into the likes of Anthony Gordon, play into Alexander Isak, who are waiting on the last line of defence. You've got Gordon in behind Timber, and you've got Isak in behind Saliba. It's this kind of play that's really taking Declan Rice out of the equation, but also at the same time it gives Newcastle that defensive flexibility that Joe Willock can offer through his sheer work, determination, quality, but also his willingness to do that part for the team. You had Anthony Gordon out on this right, you had Joe Linton out on this left, but going forwards they needed to have some attacking width. With this, they often opted for Livramento to go and support Anthony Gordon. This allowed and made sure that Hall, Burn and Cher were in a back three, and it meant that Newcastle looked something like this. Having their back three, having Longstaff and Bruno Guimaraes, allowing Joe Willock to push forwards, and they then started to create some dangerous attacks. But it was down to the sheer work rate that Newcastle had that made this all possible, and not to mention the duels that they were able to win. Newcastle actually managed to win 58% of their ground duels, and that's in comparison to Arsenal's 42%. They also managed to win 55% of their aerial duels compared to Arsenal's 45%. They won in nearly every single category, and it was this tactical setup that allowed them to really get a foothold in the match. Let me try and show you what I mean with regards to this Newcastle shape. So you've got Newcastle in possession currently, and you've got Arsenal in their defensive shape. They're 2 attackers, they're 4 midfielders, and of course you've got the back 4 over here. But let's take a look at this Newcastle shape. So you've got them in their back 3. Lewis Hall has dropped back to be part of this 3. And then you've got Tino Livramento just a little bit of the way off. That's because he's going to start to join Anthony Gordon once the ball goes forwards. You're then looking at the midfield partnership in Bruno Guimaraes and in Sean Longstaff, because you've got the forward run of Joe Willock. He's broken that line with that midfield 3 and made it towards Alexander Isak. This is not only to give Alexander Isak support, but it's also to help him pressurise and press once Newcastle start to initiate it. You've then also got Joe Linton out on this far side, as you do Anthony Gordon out on this right, making sure that you've got a real good width to this Newcastle side, but also making sure that you've got good verticality to this side with the adding forward run and breaking of Joe Willock. He had boundless energy and it was absolutely fantastic. And then from a defensive point of view, you're asking for the likes of Tino Livramento and for Lewis Hall to make sure they win their 1v1s against Bukayo Saka and Gabriel Martinelli respectively, which of course they managed to do pretty brilliantly. But again, it was this setup that stopped Arsenal from progressing through the centre of the pitch, but also made sure that it gave Newcastle a good amount of impetus to be able to go forwards and try to score a goal. In the second half, however, there was a change. Towards the end of the first half and rolling into the second, Arsenal started to do something a little bit different in the build-up. In the progression phase, they started to move Thomas Partey into the centre of the pitch. This was to partner Declan Rice once Mikel Merino vacated and occupied this left channel. Naturally, Kai Havertz drops a little bit deeper and Thomas Partey moves into midfield. This caused Newcastle a completely different problem, because instead of Joe Willock pressing just Partey or just Rice, it started to become a bit of an issue. Alexander Isak couldn't make sure that he was able to press at the correct moment, and it meant that Arsenal were able to get through the initial phase of the Newcastle press that little bit easier. So Eddie Howe decided to make a change of his own, but this one was a little bit more tactical. Instead, Newcastle changed their out-of-possession defensive shape from a 4-4-2 and alternate it to a 4-5-1, meaning that Joe Willock ended up dropping back next to Bruno Guimaraes and Sean Longstaff in a flat midfield 3. And what this did was it actually screened the centre of the pitch for Newcastle. Joe Linton ended up coming in a little bit, so did Anthony Gordon, and Alexander Isak sat in front. Now this did a couple of things. Number one, it meant that Newcastle were able to defend the centre of the pitch really well, because it meant that although Rice and Partey ended up having possession, although Newcastle ended up relinquishing possession, the passing lanes through into the centre of the pitch just weren't able to be found, which meant that Leandro Trossard barely ever got on the ball, which means that Kai Havertz really struggled to try and get on the ball himself, and it meant that then Arsenal needed to go down the flanks. But this is exactly where Newcastle wanted them to go, because of Livramento's ability to beat Martinelli in a 1v1 on this particular day, and Lewis Hall's real ability to have a good 1v1 battle with Saka. It meant that even though they had crosses coming into the box, the height and the presence of Fabian Schär and Dan Burn were able to deal with nearly any kind of threat. And even if they weren't able to deal with any kind of threat, it wasn't that likely in that particular scenario that Martinelli would be able to get past Livramento, and then Lewis Hall would be able to get past Bukayo Saka. It meant that defensively, Newcastle were extremely resolute, and it frustrated Arsenal to no end, to the point where they needed to make another change as well, swapping out a couple of players and bringing on a 17-year-old youngster to try and play that Martin Odegaard role. If that wasn't an indicator that Newcastle were doing something right, I don't know what is. Newcastle were defensively fantastic. And we can see that defensive shape right here. Here we've got a later stage of the game. Bukayo Saka is receiving the ball, but look at this Newcastle shape. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. You've then got the midfielders in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. and of course you've got Alexander Isak up top. In this particular scenario, we've had a couple of substitutions. Tonali has come into the centre of the pitch. That means that Guimaraes has moved over to that left-hand side. Joe Linton has made sure that he's staying nice and compact, but he's also able to come out and challenge Bukayo Saka with Lewis Hall if he ever needs to. And you've got Harvey Barnes out on this right-hand side, who's tucking in part of a back five to make sure that they're defensively resolute and able to follow any runs into the box. Newcastle were defensively sound. And you've also got Sean Longstaff, who's able to sweep up any kind of things that he needs to. They were absolutely set. The middle of the pitch wasn't able to be bypassed, and it meant that Arsenal needed to go down the flanks, but it just so happens that they had two absolute defensive prodigies on their hands to deal with, and they weren't able to get past. Newcastle were brilliant. And he's passing the ball over the top to Joe Willock, who makes that breaking run that we mentioned earlier on in the video forwards into that Arsenal defensive line. And it's all about trying to make sure that you're getting a challenge. And then once you have that challenge, if you win or lose, it's about your teammates come and recover. If you end up losing out on possession, and it's recovering those second balls. Newcastle were fantastic at this, and they were always hungry, always willing to work for themselves, and it was that really team dynamic that allowed them to get the better of Arsenal in this particular situation. In this situation, you've got Alexander Isak picking up that second ball, picking up that loose ball, and that's about what he does with it. Instead of trying to play a risky pass through into Anthony Gordon, because that's not on, he decides to try and then recycle it. He recycles it into Sean Longstaff, who realises that Gordon is then going to be free out on this right-hand side. But I just want to take a look at Arsenal for a second as well, because you've got Jurrien Timber, who isn't aware of Anthony Gordon at all here. You've got Marino is in a bit of a tiz here. You've got the Arsenal back line, which isn't quite set either. You've got Saliba here. You've got Partey moving in field. You've got Gabriel, who's not in line with the rest of them. You've also got the Arsenal midfielders and attackers who aren't really part of the play either. Joe Linton is out on this left-hand side in acres of space. And then you've also got Joe Willock, who is then ready to make another run down this left-hand side if the ball gets crossed in. Really good shape from Newcastle, but Arsenal, it's a little bit concerning. As the ball gets played round by Sean Longstaff, it's then about this man right here. It's all about Anthony Gordon. It's about Alexander Isak as well. It's about his run into the box and the fact that neither William Saliba nor Gabriel actually picks up Alexander Isak. It is a match made in heaven for him, because look at the space that he's got. Look at the space between the Arsenal centre-backs, and it's all about that pass right here. That cross into the box. It is perfect. Seriously, it is amazing. You probably can't get any better. If you wanted to ask for a perfect cross, that would be it. And if you want to ask for a perfect header, that would be it as well. But Newcastle earned that because of their quality, because of their determination, and because of their ability in this match, and just their sheer willingness to do what it takes. I thought Newcastle were absolutely sensational. But of course, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. What did you make of the game? What do you think of Newcastle? And of course, what do you think of Arsenal? Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I would love to hear from you. Thank you ever so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. And I hope to see you in the next one. But until then, my friends, take care.